All right, it's that time to start. Before I begin, I would like to thank everybody for coming to my session on bulletproofing your data guard configuration. I know that everyone's busy and really appreciate everyone taking their time. Before we begin, I wanted to do some overview of who I am and some of my background. My name is Stsh. I'm an Oracle ACE director. I've been doing Oracle since 1991. I've been fortunate to be able to do Oracle since right out of college. I am also the founder and president of Viscosity North America. We're a small niche consulting firm based out of Dallas. And I've been doing basically a lot of mission critical technologies around rack, data guard, a lot of data replication with SharePlex and Golden Gate. I'm also the president of the IUG Cloud SIG, and I have my own personal blog site, dbexpert.com, and I'm a certified expert data expert and rack expert. I've authored about 9 books in total, and one of the books happens to be on data guard. And so with that, I'm also a big advocate of data replication and have been a SharePlex implementation specialist for the past 10 years. And so doing a lot of things like multi-master replication and doing reporting instances and whatnot. Mentioned before, I have authored the Data Guard book with Larry Carpenter and Joe Meeks, and of our really astounding product management folks out of Oracle. And in the book, we have a lot of scripts for monitoring and management, which I will cover later in the presentation. But you can download them from my website, dbexpert.com/DG for DataGuard, or from the dataguardbook.com. I do tend to maintain my dbexpert.com more frequently, and you'll see the most recent updates on that website. Okay, so at Viscosity, we've authored about 13 books total between myself, Nitin Van Gerlicker, who's also an ACE director, and recently we were able to hire Rich Nimick. He is the author of the Performance Tuning Tips and Techniques books. And so with Rich, we have a total of 3 Oracle ACE directors at Viscosity North America, and we have 13 books in total that we've authored. It's just a fun slide that I like to present all the time, in particular with just to demonstrate that we have a lot of data that is coming out of a lot of our social media sites. And in particular, I wanted to point out that sites like Facebook, we have, this is from 2016, has 3.3 million posts every minute. And if you look at WhatsApp, which is used internationally, has 44.4 million transactions per minute. And so that's quite a bit of data that we're dealing with. And we need to leverage technologies like DataGuard to be able to replicate that data. Personally, was promoting last year was 12 days of 12-2. In particular, what we did was we took a topic every day, day before Christmas, 2 weeks before Christmas. And on day 2, we did it specifically on DataGuard. And what we also did was took the DataGuard topic and made it into a deep dive in the first quarter of 2017. And if you look at this list here, we cover pretty much the entire gamut of all the 12 tuning features. And what we do differently than what other people who are presenting on 12.2 is that if you look at it, we cover rack, data guard, partitioning, ASN, ACFS security, RMAN, things that in general, a lot of people are talking about the core DBA stuff. We cover a lot of the infrastructure and things that are part of our expertise, right? It's a little slow at it later on, but it covers Q3 and third and fourth quarter for us for the rest of the year, and we're literally adding to this every week. We've already added like 6 more sessions to this thing already. Like I mentioned before, from a data guard perspective, we have a deep dive paper that we wrote in the first quarter. And on this paper, it's more of like, plus 10 plus pages of content. And feel free to download it from viscositynA.com website. And you'll see a lot of the new features, particularly for data guard. And a lot of the stuff that we mentioned today, you can see all the details in the deep dive paper. Also, in Q2, what we did was we did a huge study on bare metal cloud, and in particular deploying PeopleSoft on bare metal cloud. And this particular paper was written jointly with Oracle, and it's going out sometime this month. And so look for updates on our website. In fact, and even better, look for updates at Oracle's website. All right. So typically when I do this in front of IUG and also in front of other conferences, I look at the audience and I take a poll to see where people are, but in this case, it's a little bit more difficult to do, but I'm assuming everyone here is either on 11G or 12C of data guard, and if not, I'll cover some aspects of it in the prior releases of data guard content for some of the people. We do have a Oracle Cloud Book that we published last year at Open World, and we're going to do an update for it at Open World this year again, because Oracle Cloud has changed so much. I am the president of the CloudSec, like I mentioned before, and we do a lot of cloud workshops. And one of the things that we give away at our workshop is a Kindle version of this book. And the reason why it's in Kindle format is because Oracle's cloud is constantly being modernized, and it's evolving because they're trying to be the best cloud in the industry. And if you do want or interested in doing a cloud workshop, in New Zealand and in Australia, give me a call. I'm sure I could work something out with Francisco. All right, with where data guard has really become popular. And so if you look at this particular slide, and in particular, we're in the early 2000s, when 9.2 became available. Actually, 9.2 I think was probably 2000 something, I forget. But when with it, data guard became really popular, and same with RAC, with RAC and data guard, and thus formed the terminology maximum availability architecture. And so we call a lot of these DBAs MAA DBAs, and then now with the release of Oracle 12.2 going live on March 1st, sorry, the slide's not updated, on March 1st of this year, now we have a new terminology called pluggable DBAs, PDBAs. And so, and I'll mention some of that later in the content as well, because there are specific data guard features that were released for pluggable databases at the time. All right, so here's some release dates that you should be attentive of. And one of the key things is that 11GR2 was released on September 2009, and 12C was introduced 2013. That's 4 years ago, right? So it's a lot of people are what we call terminal release to terminal release customers. What that basically means is that you're going to wait for the last release of Oracle to upgrade to what you consider to be the last release of the most current release. So people who are on 11GR2 right now and the terminal release customers, they're looking at upgrading to 12.2 directly now. And so that means that they're going from 2009 to 2017. And so a lot of these customers are 10 years in the upgrade cycle. And so, but just to note is that Oracle is introducing new releases every year. And for the the release customers, it's more important for them to actually upgrade sooner. All right. That was actually hit. But let's talk about upgrades. And so I guess that's the bad thing about when I can't go in the presenter mode, is that I have to go through the hidden slides. So let's talk about upgrades. And so in this particular slide, we're talking about how do I get to Oracle 12.2? And if you can see what's bolded, right? If you're on 11.203, that particular release is the release that'll take you directly to 12.2, or even to 12.1, right? But why go to 12.1 now, right? So if you're on 7.3, 8.0, or even 9i, right? You'd have to go to 9i and go to 11.203, and from 11.203 go to 12.2, right? So if you're on 11.1, you have to go to 11.204 or 12.1, right? And then go to 12.2. Okay, so a lot of people upgrade their databases leveraging the Database Upgrade Assistant. I personally am not a big fan of DBUA, mainly because of the slowness more than anything else. But the DBUA does have a lot of cool features that it does to protect us in the upgrade process. You know, one of the key things, for example, you know, it checks for adequate resources. Things like, do I have enough rollback segments, table spaces, free space, and file system or an ASN, right? It checks for invalid data types, desupported character sets, et cetera, right? I personally am a fan of running, going straight into SQL Plus and running cat upgrade and doing the upgrade manually. And it's mainly because of the speed more than anything else. And if I do run into issues, right, I do like to go look at the logs and diagnose and troubleshoot. And so, so on data guard, as we talk about upgrades, patching your database environment is very important, even for data guard. And so, particular Metalink note that you should look at is 756671, right? And this is the Oracle recommended patches. And so right now we're in early July. However, the PSUs for July have not been released yet. So the most recent PSU is April of this year. And so looking at the PSUs for non-Exadata platforms, I'm assuming more customers are non-Exadata than Exadata, right? And so you were looking at the April PSUs, and here's the appropriate patches, right? And likewise, if you're still on 11.204, right, here's the information for the April PSUs of 2017, okay? So let's go to the next screen. And so in 11.2, what Oracle did was they implemented a feature called First Patch Apply. And so what this allowed customers to do is take their data guard environment and literally switch over to their data guard, right? And apply the patch there. I'm sorry, before I switch over, apply the patch on your data guard environment first, right? And then test out the patch, right? And then you do a switchover. Switchover meaning no data loss, right? And then go back to your primary, apply the PSU, right? And then switch back, right? So this gave customers the capability to apply things like interim patches, Exadata bundle patches, and PSUs with zero downtime, okay? So that's a very important feature that some of the are not aware of yet. Okay, so let's talk about some of the history where DataGuard was literally, 20 years ago to where it is now, right? And so in Oracle 7.3, Oracle's DataGuard was called Hot Standby, right? And even on 8i, it was still called Read-Only Physical Standby. They enabled a feature called Managed Recovery, right? MRP, where it will automatically apply redo logs, right? In 9i, they introduced a feature called logical standby, which is SQL-based replication, and they gave us the capability to perform switchover and failover. And so for some of us who've been DBAs since back then, in 8i, we used to be able to do switchover, failover. We had to do a lot of manual processes with copying the control files manually and doing a lot of steps manually. But in 9i, they automated that process. They gave us capabilities for gap resolution, cascading redo. And in fact, 9.2 became with the logical standby, and they changed the name to DataGuard. And in 10G, gave us fast start failover, gave us standby redo logs, real-time apply, and giving us capabilities to flash back a database. And so in 11G, what they did was they took the flashback database, automated that capability, right? And and gave us even an enhanced product called Snapshot Standby, right? And then gave us Active Data Guard, where now I can have the database in read-only mode and still be applying archive logs. And 11G gave us the capability to compress redo transport over the network for wide area network enhanced capabilities, gave us the capabilities to take the database and convert it to a logical standby, thus calling it the rolling transient upgrade capability. So we can take a physical standby, convert it to a logical standby for the short term, and be able to perform our upgrades. So now it becomes SQL-based replication versus redo block replication, right? And gave us that capability so we can perform upgrades with zero downtime, right? And 11G gave us the capability to perform RMAN duplicates over active database. What that means is that now I do not have to take backups of my database to be able to create a standby database. 12CR1 gave us a concept called Firesink. And for those who don't know what Firesink is where I can create a Firesink instance, which is nothing more than the Oracle background processes and control files, right? And Firesink just becomes a medium where redo is sent from the primary, and Firesink just, its only job is to push archive logs to target physical standby databases. And those databases can be, anywhere in the world, right? And so the whole idea is that from the primary, I replicate redo to the Firesink instance over synchronous with an S, right, mode. And from the Firesink instance, I can go replicate archive logs to up to 30 targets in asynchronous mode, right? So it gives us the capability to be able to provide almost real-time replication of data. And if we do lose our primary database, because I'm doing synchronous replication to Firesink, right, I will not have data loss. Okay, so in 12C also gave us the capability, what they call fast sync. What that basically is, now when there's a new process that was introduced in 11.2 or 12C, it's called NSS or NSA, depending on whether you're doing asynchronous or if you're doing synchronous, right? Where NSS will actually pull redo data out of from redo buffer, right? And will actually talk directly to RFS. RFS will take that data and write that to the standby redo logs, right? And it gets and along all this process, there's a series of acknowledgements that happen, right? But most importantly, when RFS writes to the standby redo logs, right, it has to get an acknowledgement back. That acknowledgement from RFS has to be sent back to NSS. NSS goes talks to a log writer, right? And so what FastSync does is that it does not need the confirmation from RFS to standby redo logs, thus improving performance. Okay, so they give us that capability. They introduced a new role called sysdg, just like sysdba, but it's all about delineation of roles and responsibility. And they've provided a lot more features for switchover, which I'll cover later on, and even doing things like giving us the capability to rename files and whatnot on the standby. Okay, so 12c also gave us the capability to use sequences on the standby database. And this is very important for customers who are doing reporting on Active Data Guard in particular. And especially people who are summarizing data and using temp tables and using a primary key on those temp tables or whatnot, right? So now we can create sequences on the standby database. Okay. Also on the standby database in 12c, I can do an alter database move data file on the primary, and it will not impact the standby database. Also, when I do an alter database move data file, it moves the data file for me automatically as well. Okay. In 12c also, I can have temp tables on my standby database, and I can actually write to my temporary tables. That's a very new thing. And again, that feature was particularly focused for customers who are writing out temp data for sorting and aggregating and stuff like that. All right, so more 12c new features. Resumable switchover. In 12c, if a switchover fails for some reason, you can actually correct that whatever it failed on and reissue the switchover command, and it will actually continue where it left off, and it will finish the switchover. Like I said before, I can do DML on temp tables and Active Data Guard. In 12c, the using current log file is the default, and I don't have to specify that for real-time apply. I can move location of an online data file. It does not affect the standby. Another one that I like a lot is the incremental updates over TNS. What that basically means is that if I am doing a backup on the primary, and I'm shipping that and then applying that backup, right? Now I can just do it over the network and issue the command from the standby, and it'll actually back up and send that over. And I'll cover a use case for that later on. Right, so I mentioned Firesink. So if you look at the Firesink environment, right, I have a primary database writing synchronously to a Firesink instance at the same data center, right? And from there, I write asynchronously to the standby database. That's at a remote data center, right? But in the event, right, if I lost my primary database, but because I have shipped all my redo data to my Firesink instance real time, right, my standby database will not lose any data. Only in the event when I lose the entire data center will I lose data, right? So with that in mind, we'll go in a little deeper, right? So in the Firesink, I do sync no affirm, meaning that I don't wait for it to write to standby redo logs and get that acknowledgement back, right? So it's a limited distance Firesink, and I'm gonna go during my async, right? I'm gonna go over compression. So I'm gonna write to it, I'm gonna push on the pipe as much as I can, okay? I mentioned earlier we have a sysdg role, and that sysdg role has these specific permissions. Obviously, because of roles and responsibilities, right? With a sysdg role, you could do a lot of the maintenance stuff, but you can't do a lot of you don't have things like select any privileges and whatnot, right? You do have select any dictionary, which is different, right? So Firesink, let's look at what that would look like from a broker configuration perspective, right? It's quite simple. I create the config for the primary database. I add my physical standby to the config, and I enable my config, right? Next, I add my Firesink instance to the config, and I enable my Firesink, right? And the next two are basically specifically for Firesink. It's just basically saying, I'm gonna configure my Firesink to say that I'm going from my primary to my DR database, and I'm configuring my Firesink instance to be in the middle, right? Okay, so that was the 12C primary new features. I'm going to go through 12C R2 new features really quick, right? So 12.2, some of my favorites. In 12.2, we have this concept called block comparison. So now I can take my primary database environment and I can compare block for block against my standby database. And why is this important? It's important because we have this thing called lost write, and to be able to check for lost write, you have to turn on a lot of the init.org parameters. And even with that, those don't actually protect you from lost write. And so now I want to be able to, over time, be able to compare blocks, make sure there's no corruptions. And these are corruptions that are specifically caused by the storage array that's not reported back to the database, right? So in 12.2, we can have multiple observers. We can have up to 3 observers, in fact. And only one is the master. The other 2 are just simply backup observers. And in the event the master observer goes down, one of the other 2 backup observers come into play and take over. Okay, we have multiple automatic failover targets now. Prior to this release, you can only have 1 failover target. In 12.2, I can have fast start failover in maximum protection mode now, whereas before we could not. Okay. Another cool thing is that with ZDLRA and with DataGuard, we have cross-Endian support for DataGuard. That's very important, especially if you're trying to go from AIX to Linux or Linux to some other platform, right? We've had active in-memory since 12CR1. Now they've given us in-memory for active DataGuard in 12.2, which means that now I can even offload more stuff to active DataGuard. Things like AWR, SQL Tuning Pack, and whatnot, they're also available in active DataGuard as well. And with active DataGuard, I'm sorry, with just DataGuard now, there's OEM support for being able to do things like rolling upgrades. And there's a lot more support for active DataGuard as well, which basically, in this particular thing that what I'm referring to is that previously the broker had to be deconfigured for rolling upgrades. Now it's just automatically done. Okay. Broker also has enhancements for draining sessions too now, and more new features is that in 12.2 I can create a standby database with DBCA, and so I'm a big proponent of DBCA. DBCA is seems to be more and more of a standard for most companies. But the DBCA in question here is only command line. So the initial release to create a standby database, I'm going to use DBCA in silent mode. Okay, no GUI at this point. I'm sure Oracle's going to work on that coming up. Mira, multi-instance redo apply, is another new feature in 12.2. Basically, it means that I can have all of my rack instances perform redo apply. Prior to 12.2, only one instance in rack can actually apply redo. Another big one is for customers who are using pluggable databases. I can do subset standby databases now, meaning I can have one or many pluggable databases participate in DataGuard. Or I can say replicate all my pluggable databases except for these pluggable databases. So we have more granularity for pluggable databases when it comes to DataGuard. Okay. Now I can also do guarantee restore points at the PDB level. I know this isn't DataGuard, but guarantee restore points and pluggable data and DataGuard do actually have importance playing together. Another big one is password automatic sync. Now, when you update the sys password, right, redo is captured for that, and that redo is actually going to be applied to the password file on these standby databases, okay? Except for Firesink. And so if you have a Firesink instance, right, and the Firesink instance also has a password file, you must update Firesink instances manually, okay? Now with the duplicate command, I can actually create a Firesink instance also. And for DataGuard Broker, I can do a lot of the scripting like I do in SQL+. Things like, echo commands, things like set on and timing on, that kind of stuff. I can do those kind of commands in the broker as well. And so these are all mentioned in our deep dive papers. And so you can download all this from our website, right? So, all right, so here's my top 12 DataGuard failures. I could actually spend the next hour just talking on this one slide, but for sake of time, and because I do have a lot more slides, we'll go over the top 12 as fast as possible. But if we don't get past this, but this is the area that majority of the customers have issues when it comes to DataGuard. All right. So number one, removal of archive logs, right, before they're applied in the standby database, right? So typically this happens when a DBA, by mistake, will remove an archive log on the primary database because they got an alert saying that the archive space is about to run out of space, right? Or it did run out of space, and when they were trying to clean up, right, they cleaned up too much. Okay, so what happens in this situation? A lot of DBAs think that you have to recreate the standby database, and that's completely not true. What you can do is you can find out what the SCN is on the standby database and get that information, go to the primary, and do a backup of the primary database from the SCN, right? And do that incremental backup, ship the incremental backup to the standby database, right? And actually do a recovery of that standby database. And that allows you to get past that missing archive log. Okay? Another common failure for those who are in rack, and particularly for those who are on ASM on rack, right? When you add a data file, sometimes you forget that plus sign. And I get calls quite a bit from customers. And their DataGuard breaks. At that point, DataGuard is typically the last thing that they worry about because their rack has broken first, right? And so in this particular situation, right, we have to go through the process of moving that data file back into ASM, right? And at the same time, fixing that on the DataGuard side. Okay. So another one is, like I said before, when you run out of space on the file system or ASM disk group, right, causes issues on the DataGuard side. And so things like that, we proactively monitor the free space on file systems and free space on ASM, right? The next one is DB recovery file desk size. A lot of people set this. In fact, just about everywhere I go, this is set. And this is where I tell all my consultants, this is where we actually inflict outages ourselves, right? So classic example, right? I have a FRA with 1 terabyte of space, right? So why would I set DB recovery file desk size to be, let's say 100 gigs when I have a terabyte for that disk group, right? And so now if I set that, I not only have to monitor my FRA free space, I have to also monitor my space consumption of my DB recovery file desk size and compare that to what that value is set to, and do the free space calculation based on that as well, right? So I generally tell our consultants, unless you're in a SaaS or multi-tenant environment, right, set that to be the same size as the size of the FRA, okay? Number 5 is the standby file management. By default, this is still set to manual. And that I really don't understand why, but for some reason it is. And when you create a new data file on the primary, right, you start getting unnamed data files on the standby, right? And so, that actually will cause an outage if you don't have the set on. not an outage, but will actually stop MRP, right? And so we need to be able to deal with unnamed data files and to look at standby file management and .ro parameter proactively, making sure that it's set to. Biggest one, no PSUs applied. When I get calls from my friends who have stability issues on DataGuard, and they have issues that are bizarre on DataGuard, first question I ask, what PSU are you on, and what version of work are you on, right? And so, and I see, believe it or not, a lot of customers do not apply PSUs, right? So PSUs and bundle patches and one-off patches are just as important in DataGuard configurations than they are on rack on primary database as well. Okay. Another one is obviously archive log destination getting 100% full. That's obvious in the primary, but what's more common is archive logs destination getting full in the standby. So I see a lot of customers monitoring archive space destination on the primary, but I also do not see them monitoring that on the standby database. So that's something that we have to do as well. Another one is when they stop, when they reboot a server or they have an outage and they have to bounce the database, they do not restart MRP. And so, but it's more of the reboot than anything else, is that a lot of shops on the standby database side, they don't have MRP auto starting as part of the startup process. Okay. Sys password change, like I mentioned before, this is a feature in 12.2, but most people are not on 12.2 yet, so it's still an issue. When you change the password for sys on the primary, you must manually propagate the password file to the standby database. Okay. When I say broker changes and alter system changes, what I mean by that is that I see more and more customers adopting OEM 12C or OEM 13C now, right? And leveraging OEM to configure, maintain, and monitor their data guard, which is a great best practice. However, there are broker configuration properties, and there are also alter system in the .ro parameters that modify the same parameters. And so if you are leveraging the broker, you are literally married to the broker, and you cannot use the alter system command to change the same parameters that the broker is responsible for. And this is typically the things like archive dest parameters. And so ultimately, if you are using OEM, OEM depends on the broker, and that's actually a prerequisite for OEM monitoring and maintenance. And so you must know not to use alter system to modify these parameters. And this is what I tell a lot of DBAs, is that before you leverage OEM, make sure you know what the broker is doing behind the scene. And before you know what the broker is doing, and before you start using the broker, make sure you know what that does to the .ro parameters and how that can be done with SQL Plus as well. Okay, and so another thing to consider is that guarantee restore points. Make sure you use guarantee restore points before you do any kind of maintenance work. Whether you do PSUs or whether you do 11.2 to 12.2 upgrades or 12.1 to 12.2 upgrades, always create a guarantee restore point, right? And after you're done and with your effort, and if you're successful, go back and delete it, because it will keep all your archive logs, right? And last thing is looking at your no logging activities, right? Make sure that you are capturing no logging transactions on the primary database, and you know what's not being no logged. And so for most people, they will have adopt best practices, and they will actually force log on the database itself. but there are a lot of companies where, because especially in data warehousing environments, where they do need no logging on some of the tables that are constantly being loaded. Okay. All right, so we covered the top 12 common failures, right? So let's talk about how we're going to monitor some of our environments so that we can proactively prevent a lot of these things, right? And not only just preventing, but catch them early so it doesn't become a crisis, right? And one of the big things that we can monitor for is alert logs, right? Most people will monitor alert logs on the primary, but they will forget to monitor alert logs in the standby database, right? And the alert log monitoring goes beyond just database. If you're rack, you must monitor the alert log on the ASM instance as well, and also in the primary and the standby database. Okay. Also look for archive gaps and deviances, right? So you must know that what your sequence number is on the primary, and you have to also know what your sequence number is on the standby, right? And if that gap becomes, let's say, more than 100 or 50 or even 10 for some customers who need that level of SLA, right? Is make sure when you have that gap and that gap is greater than that deviant number, send an alert, right? And going back to the alert logs, right? There's a lot of alert logs, a lot of entries in alert logs, right? A lot of or dash messages, right? And so what I've done is I've created and assembled like 20 critical alerts, right? For these, it goes to the pager, and the rest goes to email. And we even have an ignore list that we create. And I'll be more than happy to share that with anybody who's interested. Just send me an email or hit me up on Twitter or whatnot, and I'll share that with you. Another thing to monitor is the transport lag. What that basically means is that how long does it take for redo stream to go from my primary database to my standby database, right? And so that could be a factor of how slow my network is, or it could be other issues, right? My disk is too slow in the primary, or I had a network failure, or things like that, right? And then the last is apply lag. This is how fast is my standby database able to apply the redo or archive log as it gets here, right? And so we generally, depending on the customer, we have customers who have active data guard, and we have transport and apply lag. If it's greater than a minute, we send the alert, right? For other customers who don't have that kind of regiment requirement, we set it for like 4 hours or even 8 hours, depending on their requirement, right? Another thing to monitor is file system monitoring or ASM monitoring to your file system or your ASM disk group. Make sure you set your apply PSUs, right? One of the things we always recommend is do an N-1 consideration for PSU. What does that mean, right? Just like I mentioned before, let's say that the July PSU already came out, right? You don't want to be that person to be applying the July PSU now, right? So if you're going to apply PSUs now, apply the April PSUs. Okay, so now if it's, let's say it was September, right? And I'm looking at applying PSUs, right? July might be something that you would consider, not doing an N-1 for, right? Okay, so, and also, like I mentioned before, OEM is the best practices, and leveraging OEM, those commands are, right? Lastly, right, and I have a lot of customers in the financial area, they perform quarterly switchover testing, right? And they literally switch over every quarter, test all their processes, right? And the key thing is that if you do perform quarterly testing, right, you can find, oh, I have corrupted indexes because I've forgot to enable flashback logging, right? Or I have issues on my storage array, and so I'm able to find that proactively. Okay. Like I mentioned before, the SysDG role is a 12.1 thing, but I just wanted to show and demonstrate how that worked, right? And so I created a user called DGOpper, granted it SysDG, and now I can log into my DataGuard broker using DGOpper right here. Okay. Okay, let's look at some of the best practices. I mentioned here, download the DG Toolkit, and that the DG Toolkit has all the best practices in mind. Earlier, I mentioned that I have at dbaexpert.com/DG, right? I have in that folder list of conferences, and in particular, I think you will look for IOUG 2017, which is this year, right? In it, you'll have all these files, right? And so the DG Toolkit was designed back in 2007 timeframe, and I've been updating it every year as part of major conferences as I speak. And with every release of Oracle, I update that, right? But it has a set of menus that will guide you through things like creating a physical standby, and I'll go through that as fast as I can in the upcoming sessions. I do have some slides here, but it has menus for RMAN, dedicated RMAN screens, menus for creating Firesink instance, menus for DataGuard Broker, right, and even like doing a duplicate database. Right, it has all that stuff in there. And the cool thing is that it doesn't actually just run it; it spits out a script for you to look at. Right? It spits out SQL statements, and it also spits out shell scripts for you to look at. And from there, you can tweak and modify as needed. So that was the intent, to share knowledge and to be able to demonstrate the capabilities that it has. All right. So let's look at some of the best. Okay. So from a network layer, right? We want to make sure that we set SDU to 32K for synchronous. For async, it has no bearing in performance, but you can set SDU at a SQLnet.aura if you want it to be global, right, across all your databases, or you can set it at the listener or TNSnames.aura if you want it for specific databases. Okay, so another one is called BDP, bandwidth delay product, and what that does is it sets two parameters: the send buff size and the receive buff size. And with that, you got to also make sure that your kernel parameters for TCP, write mem, and read mem are set appropriately. But I have two scripts called DGBDP core shell script, and uses a config file that you actually modify, and you specify in that config file what kind of network you have and what your latency is, right? And so based on that, the bandwidth delay product, the actual algorithm is times latency times 3, okay? And in the dgbdp.conf, you tell it whether you're an OC3, OC12, whatever, right? And then it has an RTT response time. That's the round trip time response time, right? And then what that basically means is that when I send a ping command from my primary database server to my physical standby server, right? That's the round trip that it took, right? But you can't just do a standard ping because the packet size that it sends is not big enough. And so there's two parameters. There's one with a -c count. You want at least more than one. There's another parameter -s that tells it the size of the packet, right? You want to make it about 64K, right? And you want to be able to send that ping command, and it'll tell you what the response time is, right? You take that, and then and you run dgbdp, and you can look at the shell script if you want to look at the algorithm, right? And it calculates what we call bandwidth delay product, right? And that bandwidth delay product becomes the end result of your TNS and your listener entries for those two parameters that I mentioned before: send buff size and receive buff size. Okay, and what that basically means is that every time I make a round trip from my primary to my standby database, it's going to send as big as pipe as possible over the network. Okay, so other fast recovery area best practices, right, is that you want to set your large archive desk to use the recovery file desk. And for customers who are not using flashback logging, here are some best practice recommendations from the MAA team at Oracle, right? And so even though you may not want to use flashback retention and flashback logging, right, what they're saying is that you want to set it to 60 minutes to be able to do flashback reinstantiation. right? And that's if you lose, let's say, the primary data center, right? And then, but if your data on your standby database is within 60 minutes, right? I can actually go and flash back the database to where that was. And instead of having to recreate my primary, right? I can restart DataGuard and boom, I'll have data propagating back to the primary, right? And to protect yourself from user errors, right, and logical corruptions, and obviously malicious users, they're recommending that you set the retention target to 6 hours. Okay, so blockchain tracking. If you're not using blockchain tracking, you should definitely use blockchain tracking. You can even use blockchain tracking on your DataGuard, but it does incur a active DataGuard license. So that's something to be something to be careful about, right? And to look at your BCT file, look at $B blockchain tracking virtual view. Okay. Right. So let's see here. Let's look at standby redo logs, right? So standby redo logs have been around since 10G. We want to make sure that we use standby redo logs on the primary and standby. Most people just create it in a standby database, but as best practices, create it on the primary as well. There's also a formula, right? You want your standby redo logs to be the number of online redo logs plus 1 times the number of threads, right? What that basically means is that if I have a 2-node rack and I have, let's say, 5 online redo logs, right? That means that I'll have 5 online redo logs for each node, which means on the primary, I have 10 online redo logs, right? I'm going to have 12 standby redo logs, right? So on my DG toolkit, I provide a script called DG generate standby redo PointShell scripts, and it actually will spit out 2 SQL scripts for you to create on the primary and on the DR side. Okay. Force logging, everybody knows that this is the best practice, but however, there are companies out there because of the data volume that they have. Some developers may do no logging transactions, and so you want to make sure that you monitor force logging at the table space level and at the table level also, right? But also at the data file level. Okay, so I'll provide scripts for you to do that as well. Know your archive generation rates, right? So if you look at what's bolded in red, right, it says that I have at 1 in the morning I generate 25 archive logs, right? Which means that on February 23rd I'm looking at 16, 25, 23, 20, 15, right? So by the time I hit 8 o'clock, right, I might be 8 hours behind on my redo transport because it just can't. The wide area network just can't transmit that data fast enough, right? And so make sure that you know your archive generation rate and you also know your redo log size as well, right? Script that calculated the screen above, this one right here, right? Image copies, right? So what do you do if you have a file database? How do you back that up weekly, right? Or if you have a petabyte database, right? And so for a lot of people, and I find this very fascinating, a lot of DBAs don't know what image copy is. So I'm going to just spend 30 seconds on high level, right? Back in the old days, right, when we did not have RMAN, what we did was we put the table space in backup mode, and we looped through each table space, find out what the data files were, and we actually copy the data files manually. And then when the copy was done, we ended the backup mode for that database, for that table space, right? And so, but when we actually copied the files, right, it's an image copy of the actual file. So what an image copy of the database is literally exactly that. It's an image copy of every file of the database, right? And so, but the thing is that what I like to do with this particular comparison is that I call it my 0 + 1 = 0 architecture. What that means is that from a RMAN perspective, right, I take a level 0 backup, which is my full backup, that's the exact image of my database, right? I take an incremental backup every night, right? And I take the incremental and I apply that to the level 0, and I get a new level 0. And that new level 0 is a exact image of the database that I just backed up, right? And so With the image copy, we'll call it forever incrementals. And with that, you never have to take another full backup of the database ever. Okay. And if you go to dbexpert.com/rmanentodisk, I actually have a script called rmanentodisk.ksh that was introduced in the DataGuard book, and I actually provide examples and use cases of how to use it for cron and files actually mean. Okay. So this pretty quickly because I know we're running out of time. Like I mentioned before, the DG Toolkit. This is the primary menu that you see when you launch the DG Toolkit. You can see that I have a option number 10 is a sub menu, which is another menu that's probably about just as big. And basically, you run through a series of checks before you actually do anything, right? Number 20 is building a standby database. And this goes from old school to duplicate database and active database as well. And so then we have the data broker, we have the monitoring menu, and with the Firesink menu. 50 is a logical standby, but that hasn't been updated in quite a while. But for those who are using it, it's very informative. It's got a lot of stuff. 60 is very important, ADR and maintaining your automatic diagnostic repository. I have an RMN submenu, and option 200 is what I'm going to show you here. Okay, and so if you look at 200, a single command, the DG duplicate database corn shell script, right? It's a single command that will actually spit out scripts, right, in the temp DBA directory. And it'll say, run this on your physical standby or run this on all servers, right? And basically, it's for you to look at, and but it gives you the capability to create a standby database with literally as 1, 2, 3 kind of format, right? And so it leverages a config file, dgconf, and that is completely outside the scope of this, but we can probably do another session on how to leverage some of these scripting, right? But it creates the temp DBA directory, it sets up the basic init.r parameters to create my auxiliary instance, starts up no mounts that auxiliary instance, registers that with the listener, and then it issues the duplicate database, right? This duplicate database, I worked on it with Larry Carpenter, who is the product manager for DataGuard. And basically, it's a one script that does everything, right? It connects to the primary, creates my auxiliary, and allocates channels from auxiliary. It issues a duplicate from active database, which means I don't need a backup. It's going to recover as much as it can. It's going to copy the SP file, and it's going to change all the SP file parameters to what I have here. And also going to change my, with the primary channel, right? I'm going to do alter systems on my primary as well, right? And I'm going to recover the database. And that will actually create me a standby database that is actually current with my primary, okay? And so let's look at some, lastly, I'll go through as fast as I can. These are the monitoring. As I mentioned before, we have extensive alert log monitoring. And if you do want a copy of this, I'll be more than happy to share them with you. The alert log monitoring, our script leverages Perl. And instead of looking at the entire alert log and doing a diff, right? What our scripts do is it actually knows where it ended last, where the end of the file was last time when it checked the alert log. And then it'll go from there to the end of the file when it checks next, right? So it constantly goes from the end of the file where it was left off last to the current end of the file. And it checks for error messages. And we even have ignore dat or as well. So it'll actually ignore certain alerts. We even have critical ones that says, if this is critical, send a page, otherwise just send us emails. So by monitoring the alert log, you should actually know when your database hiccups, right? And that's the whole intent, right? It looks at the ETIOR tab, and it performs diffs and compares since the last execution. And we have another notification shell that's completely elaborate and can alert based on emails to pagers to escalations as well, right? So log rotate. A lot of people don't know what log rotate is, and they think it's only for system all of our listener logs, ASM logs, et cetera, right? And monitoring. This is checking MRP. This is checking the transport apply lag, like I mentioned before. This is monitoring the apply lag, apply rate, and I'm going to stop here. There's some stuff on EBS for those customers who are EBS. I cover some slides here. I'll provide the whole slide deck, but I'm going to end it here, and let's see if I have any questions. If I don't have any questions, I'm going to end it here, and I will end it with this. Follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and what's this one? Whatever that is, and Google, Instagram. That's what that is. And so, and with that, I'll end it. And thank you everyone for attending. And hopefully, I'll talk to you soon. All right. Thank you very much.